If you enjoy the story, give it a like and leave a comment. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and click on the bell icon so you can be the first to hear new Cryptid Tales. Be sure to check out the t-shirts and other items listed below the video description and grab some Cryptid Tales gear to help support the channel. As always, if you've had your own encounter with the unexplained, I'd love to hear about it. Send me an email at cryptidtalesmail@gmail.com. The story I'm about to tell you has never been told to anyone before. I'm passing it along to you because at this point in my life, I have finally reached a point where I am no longer afraid. I'm no longer afraid of that thing that's memory has haunted me every day since I found it, or that it found me, whichever the case it was. When this happened, I was a young man, 14 if I remember right, not much older than my grandson is now. Now I'm an old man, and my body is tired. Memories of the past are getting foggier by the day. Maybe that's another reason I'm finally willing to talk about what happened to me that day in the woods so many years ago. At the time, there were few things more important to me than fishing and hunting, skills my grandfather had passed down to me, along with the values that go along with those skills. Values and morals that have been forgotten or discarded in modern times, but things were different back then. I say this because some people might wonder what a kid was doing traipsing around in the wilderness all alone, with nothing but a .22 rifle and a well-sharpened hunting knife on his hip to keep him company. There's no telling how so many of us reached adulthood with all the perils of childhood we faced on a regular basis back then. The thing is, we always felt safe. Guess the rest of the world hadn't taught us any different yet. But trust me, at the time I was much more in danger of unknown things hiding in the dark than I was of having an accident with my own weapon. Of course, I hadn't learned that lesson yet either, but I soon would. I was staying at my grandparents' place at the time. There was an old John boat Grandpa would let me take out on my own to fish some jug lines. It was slow going, but I didn't mind. I felt like a real man out there on the water on my own, looking for spots to set my lines out and chasing them down the next day. My catfishing travels eventually led me across the lake to an area that was foreign lands to me. A small inlet snaked its way inland, and it seemed like a great place to drop off a line or two. The first time I made my way in there, a pair of does were drinking at the shoreline. We watched each other for a good minute or so before they slowly walked back into the cover of the forest. But what really caught my attention was the barking of squirrels coming from the canopy. I loved hunting squirrels, maybe even more so than I loved eating them, and I loved my grandma's fried squirrel and gravy. That night at supper, I asked my grandpa, who owned the land on the other side of the lake, and if he thought they would mind if I did some squirrel hunting. My grandpa just kept staring at his plate for a moment of contemplation, and then looking over the top of his thick-rimmed glasses, told me that it was government land, before taking another bite of his dinner roll. I reminded him again of the second part of my question, the part about hunting squirrels. I waited patiently while he took a drink of his sweet tea to wash down his bite of dinner roll. "I reckon it ought to be all right, long as you don't see any trespassing signs," he said as he wiped his mouth with a napkin. "I've never hunted over there, but as far as I know, that's all government owned from the far side of the lake all the way to the interstate." To be perfectly honest, I probably would have gone anyway, but now that I had my grandfather's permission, morning couldn't get there fast enough. I was making my way across the lake at sunrise. The bright orange light twinkled on the surface of the water as I paddled towards the inlet where I had seen the deer the day before. I may have set a personal best record for making it across the lake that morning, with anticipation of the day's hunt on my mind. For a boy my age, the thought of exploring new lands was every bit as exciting as the hunt itself, and the fact that my own grandpa had never set foot there made it all the more adventurous to me. The front of the boat hit the shoreline with a slight thud. I pulled the old John boat up onto the shore so it wouldn't float away while I was off on my adventure. I grabbed my little .22 rifle and slung it over my shoulder, my army canteen that was filled with Grandma's sweet tea, and an old burlap sack to carry any squirrels I might get along the way. Inside the sack was one of my grandpa's red handkerchiefs with a couple leftover dinner rolls from the night before, in case I got hungry. Seeing how I had no idea where I was going, really, I felt my best course of action was to walk directly away from the boat inward. That way, if I felt lost, all I had to do was turn around and walk back until I hit the lake. Plus, I had heard the squirrels barking from that direction, and that's where the good squirrel trees would most likely be. About an hour or so had gone by, and I had walked quite a ways. I had seen a few squirrels, but didn't have a good shot on any of them. One of the rules Grandpa had always taught me: don't take a shot if you aren't certain of it. My stomach was starting to feel empty, so I took a seat at the base of a tree and dug out one of the rolls. My grandma made the best rolls. I know a lot of people say that about food their grandmother makes, but I really do mean it. In my entire life, I never tasted a roll that came close to hers. It's funny that here I am in my final years, and I still miss those rolls. I still miss her. While I sat there doing my best to actually chew my bites of dinner roll before swallowing, a cool breeze chilled the beads of sweat on my forehead. I could hear the sound of the leaves in the tops of the trees as they rattled in the wind. I looked up between the limbs and saw the sky was a light gray instead of blue. Rain was moving in. One time I had to use the boat as a temporary shelter by flipping it over and laying it over a log. I was too far from the boat to do that now, but as long as it didn't storm, I'd be all right in the tree cover. As I took a swig off my canteen and twisted the cap back on, something through the trees caught my attention. It looked like some sort of man-made structure, like a small concrete building barely peeking over the ground from my line of sight. I stood up to get a better view. I could see what looked like the top of the structure, but it appeared to be in a lower area than where I was, so I couldn't see much of it. I started making my way towards it. As I approached it, I found myself at the top of a small rise, looking down into what looked like a bowl-shaped lowering, almost like a crater that had been consumed by the forest. In the middle of the depression was a small concrete building. The structure was basically a cube, maybe 7 feet tall, with a large, thick, rusty metal door that was slightly open, with one of the bottom hinges broken, causing it to sit crooked. I looked around hesitantly before walking down to it. On the outside of the building were some stenciled letters and numbers, spray painted in black. X77B. On the door was a sign, Authorized personnel only, do not enter, U.S. Gov. Drops of rain started splashing on the sides of the building, turning the concrete darker as they hit. I grabbed the edge of the thick metal door and tried pulling it farther open, but it wouldn't budge. I stuck my head in the opening to get a look inside. It was hard to make out anything, it was so dark inside, the only light coming from the opening of the door, which was no more than a foot or so, allowed me to see that the inside was basically empty. There seemed to be some sort of metal box on the back wall, with what looked like a telephone receiver sitting on top. I took another look around, leaned my rifle against the door, and then slowly slid my way through the opening. It was much darker now that I was inside, The walls were all blank, save for the strange phone box on the back wall. It was just a concrete room in the middle of the woods. No light, no chair, no nothing. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Why would the government build a concrete vault out in the middle of nowhere and just abandon it? Something told me not to do it, but I couldn't help myself. I just had to pick up that phone receiver and see what happened. There were no phone wires, or any wires for that matter, coming off the building. Were they buried underground? I had no idea who would answer or how much trouble I might be in if they did, but I had to find out. One thing I hadn't initially noticed about the building was that the only thing not made of concrete or metal was the floor. The floor was made of wooden planks, which reached from one side of the room to the other. As I stepped across the floor to reach the phone box, the boards started creaking and popping. Before I had time to react, the boards I was standing on gave way, and I was suddenly falling through an opening in the floor. I don't remember much of the fall. I'm not even sure what happened. I must have hit my head when I fell because I remember slowly waking up from being unconscious. When my head cleared enough to understand what had happened, I slowly opened my eyes and tried sitting up. I was in complete darkness. There was a slightly less dark area where the hole in the floor was that I fell through. It looked to be about 8 to 10 feet above me and was barely visible. The ground I was on wasn't really solid. It was strange to me, but something about it was also familiar. It was like I was sitting on a pile of sticks. My eyes strained as I looked around, but there was nothing to see but darkness. It was like being submerged in ink. Wherever I was, it smelled awful. It reminded me of what it smelled like at the slaughterhouse where my uncle used to work. For some reason, this sent a chill down my spine. My body ached all over from the fall, but I didn't feel like anything was broken. I wiggled my ankles and both were fine. I bent my knees, they seemed okay as well. When I set my leg back down, some of the sticks I was on shifted and rattled around. I felt around in the dark for one and picked it up, feeling it with my hands like a blind person might study something. It was long and smooth, with a slight curve. One end of it seemed to be spread wider and flatter. I set it down and picked up another, larger one. This one felt slightly different. It wasn't smooth like the other, but had patches of roughness. At one end it was broken and I could feel the sharp edges of the break with my fingertips. The other end felt like a small bony fist. It reminded me of something, but it wasn't a stick. I reached around, now almost frantically, in the dark picking up stick after stick. I'd try to break one, first with my hands, then pressing it over my knee, but I couldn't break them. That's when I realized what I really already knew. What my inner voice had been shouting at me since I woke up, but I had been ignoring it out of fear. These weren't sticks. These were bones. My entire body became suddenly weak as an overwhelming fear poured over me. As far as I could reach, I felt bones, nothing but bones. My stomach turned, but luckily, other than my grandma's leftover roll, there was nothing to throw up. I jumped to my feet with a sudden urgency to get out of this nightmarish pit I had fallen into. My feet slid and twisted as they tried to find a steady base to stand on, the bones popping and scraping against one another as my full weight became supported on my own two legs again. I looked up at the barely visible hole above my head. How would I get out of here? I was tall for my age, but there was no way I could jump up that high, let alone pull myself up if I somehow managed to grab a hold. And who says the boards would hold? They already broke under my weight once, sending me into this pit of bones. I reached around me in the darkness, as far out as my arms would reach, but felt nothing. I slowly started a stumbled walk on the shaky surface of bones, making my way towards where I thought the front of the concrete building was facing. I had no idea how large this underground cavern was, but at least it was a direction to move in. Standing in one spot would do me no good. In a short 2 or 3 steps, my outreached hands felt the surface of a solid wall. Was this rock? Concrete? No, it was dirt, packed dirt. The cold surface of the wall made me realize how cold it really was down there. I guess that's to be expected beneath the ground in a cavern where sunlight never reaches. A cavern of bones. I looked up towards the opening, my mind racing, trying to figure out a way out of this predicament I was in. Eventually, my grandfather would come looking for me. He knew where I was, kind of. But was there any guarantee he would find the building? I only found it by accident, and it was more than an hour hike from where I left the John boat. How would he know which direction I went? It was up to me to get out on my own. I knew my grandpa would never stop looking for me until he found me, but I didn't want to wait that long, and I couldn't help but think, what if? What if he didn't find me in time? How long could I make it without food and water in this hole? The burlap sack with the last roll tucked inside the handkerchief was lying on the ground next to my rifle. I had my knife on my hip still, and about half a canteen of my grandma's sweet tea. I sat back down on the pile of bones with my back against the dirt wall. I fumbled around in the darkness to pull the canteen off my belt and unscrew the lid. The tea was no longer cold, but the sweetness shocked the taste buds in my mouth as I took a big swig off the canteen. I screwed the lid back on and fastened it back to my belt. I remember sitting there with my mind racing between different thoughts. How was I going to get out? Why was this here? Why was the building there? What time was it? Were my grandparents worried yet? Were they already looking for me? Then, my inner voice asked a question that overpowered all the others. A question that shot ice through my veins and stopped my heart dead in its tracks. What was that noise? I sat up straight, pressing my back firm against the dirt wall. I stopped breathing, stopped moving. I would have stopped time itself if possible. All I did was listen. The kind of listening you do when you're lying in bed at night in the dark, afraid, trying to listen for the ghost that is watching you from the end of the bed. The kind of listening you do when you hope that you don't hear anything. But I had heard something. Something made a noise. Something was down there with me. My ears strained against the silence. I slowly drew in a breath of air through my nose. There, from somewhere in the darkness surrounding me, the sound of breathing. But it wasn't an echo of my own breathing. These breaths were much slower and deeper than my own. My throat felt like it was filled with cement, and my eyes started to fill with tears. What was down there with me? I was terrified. That's the only word that I can use to describe what I was feeling, but I assure you this was something beyond fear. I shot up in a panic and started reaching and clawing at the dirt wall, jumping up and trying to find something, anything to grab a hold to, and pull myself out of this bone-scattered grave. With each moment, I expected to feel claws grab me from behind, or the feeling of teeth sinking into the back of my leg. But I just kept jumping and reaching in futile attempts to defy gravity and crawl up the flat surface of the wall. I started to work my way to the left, with outreached arms, sweeping the surface of the wall. Anything that might mean freedom. But nothing was there. Nothing but the feeling of more and more bones beneath my feet with every step I took. There was no floor, there was no ground. Only bones. A deep ascending growl ending with a loud huff rattled through the darkness and vibrated my chest. It was quickly followed by the sound of bones scattering everywhere. I heard one hit the wall beside me, causing me to yell. I dropped down, pressing my body against the wall, guarding myself with my arms. Huge, heavy footsteps crunched through the bones. I wasn't sure, but it sounded like it was maybe 20 feet away. The only relief I had was hearing the steps going from side to side like it was pacing, but not coming towards me. I slowly lowered my arms. I sat there quietly sobbing, my eyes burning with tears and my heart beating out of my chest. I was so afraid at this point that it didn't even seem real anymore. It seemed like some sort of nightmare my mind had conceived on its own, but this was nothing my own mind would have ever been able to create, nothing this frightening. I pulled up the collar on my shirt and wiped the tears out of my eyes, peering off into the darkness, listening for the creature across from me. Its breathing had quickened and picked up a slight wheezing sound. I heard the sound of more bones being displaced and shuffled around. I think the thing had sat down at this point, but I had no way of knowing for sure. It's not that I was calming down from the state of fear I was in, but more tiring out from the emotional exhaustion. I've heard people talk about going into shock during a traumatic event, and maybe that's what I was experiencing then. I don't really know. As I sat there, too afraid to move and too tired to stand, I started noticing something in the darkness. Coming into focus were two barely visible orbs, just a slight glow among the void, slightly moving, disappearing for a second and then coming back, but always in unison. Eyes. It was the creature's eyes. Just the faintest of eye shine, but it was there. It was directly across from me, but in those pitch black conditions, I had no sense of distance. All I could tell was that they seemed large, about the size of the golf balls my grandpa liked to hit out in the field behind his house, and they were much higher up than mine. I had to tilt my head back slightly to see them. Did that mean it could see me? The thought made my entire body tense up and a chill run up my spine. I don't know why, but the idea that it was sitting there watching me made it worse. I don't know how long I had been sitting there, with my eyes locked on those two faintly glowing orbs, but there was no way I was going to take my eyes off of it. It was the only way I knew where it was, and the thought that it had been down there the entire time, and all the time I had no idea it was there. I didn't want to think about it anymore. The truth is, all I could do is sit there and stare towards it listening. I was too afraid to do anything else. I was afraid if I did anything, it might attack me. For now, I was accepting that I would sit there and hopefully my grandpa would come rescue me before something terrible happened. I had resigned to the fact that there was nothing I could do. I would be helpless if the thing decided to attack me. That's when I remembered. I still had my knife. A last line of defense. I undid the loop around the handle and slowly pulled it from the old worn leather sheath. I held it out in front of me, pointed into the darkness, towards the creature. Even though I couldn't see the knife, nor did I have any idea what I was actually down there with, feeling the familiar wooden handle in my hand made me feel somewhat safer. The thing let out a deep huff and the sound of bones clacking echoed through the air. My grip around the knife handle tightened. The unseen creature started making a sound that was somewhat familiar. After a few seconds, I was certain it was sniffing something. Like when Hank would sniff around trying to find a dropped piece of food under the dinner table. Hank was the name of my grandparents' dog. The neighbor hit him with his truck the summer before that. On accident, supposedly, but I never trusted it. I wished Hank had been there with me then. But I was alone. Just me and the monster in the dark. The sniffing increased and my ears told me it was moving around, like it was trying to find something. It stopped briefly before the sniffing seemed to be slower and more focused. I could hear the rustling of bones, then the sound of sniffing and bones hitting other bones like they were being dropped one at a time. What was it doing? I could still see those two glowing dots across from me, but I was becoming more and more nervous with each passing second. At first, I was confused. My mind was racing, trying to find the answer, trying to explain the noises I was hearing coming from the creature. It was right there. I knew these sounds, but down there in that dark hole, completely consumed with fear, it made it difficult to think, difficult to remember. As my mind raced, my ears focused on the sounds I was hearing. They weren't getting louder, but they seemed to fill every bit of space around me. A scraping sound, but not rocks. Was it sharpening something? Was it sharpening a bone? Then, a loud cracking sound suddenly pierced the air, causing me to slam my back firmly against the dirt wall behind me. When I regained my composure and was convinced it wasn't attacking me, it popped in my head what the sounds were. I shifted my head slightly to listen, to confirm my thoughts. I could hear the thing making slurping and slobbering sounds, disgusting sounds, followed with the sound of snapping and crunching. I was certain of it now. The creature was eating. It was eating the bones. I felt repulsed by the sounds, by the thought of the monster hidden in the darkness across from me salivating, snapping, chewing away at the leg bone of some animal, or even more frightening, someone who had found themselves in this pit, the same pit I was in now. Even in the darkness, I could feel my head spinning. I pulled myself slowly up to my feet. My knees trembled beneath the weight of my own body. The chewing stopped for a moment, but quickly began again with another snap and more popping and crunching. I didn't know what to do. I felt hopeless, but I wanted to put as much distance between myself and those two expressionless glowing orbs as I could. With my back against the wall, I continued working my way to the right, away from the creature. I've heard in my life that when you go blind, your other senses increase in sensitivity to compensate for the loss of sight. I'm sure that takes a while to happen, but down in that hole, it sure seemed like it happened to me. Being in that darkness, I could hear each and every sound, even the slightest noise. Each step I took, even though I was trying to be as quiet as possible, seemed magnified, as if I was stomping and kicking through the bones like there were piles of fall leaves in the yard. Even my own heartbeat, I swear I could hear my own heart through my chest. And that sound, that horrible gnawing, the sound of teeth gnashing against the hard bones until they snapped and cracked open, only to be followed with that disgusting slobbering and slurping sound as it tried to suck out whatever marrow might be left. I extended out my right hand to guide me along the wall in the darkness, when it bumped into something hard, not dirt. I jerked my hand back like I had touched a hot stove. I gathered myself and slowly slid my hand back out. There, I could feel it. It wasn't alive, and it wasn't a bone either. My fingers worked around it as I tried to identify it. I thought, yes, I was positive, it was a root, a tree root probably. It was about the size of my own forearm. I slid my fingers along the root, tracing where it led in the darkness. Down, almost to the top of the bone pile, before it plunged its way back into the dirt wall. Upwards, as far as I could reach, it was almost like a rope. How far did it reach before going back into the dirt? Was it high enough for me to climb? For me to escape? I looked back towards the sounds of the creature and listened. Still eating. I started feeling my way around in the dark as I tried to guide my knife back into the sheath. Such a simple task only made nearly impossible in the dark. The creature suddenly let out a bellowing grunt, almost like a bark, and the sounds of bones went scattering through the dark. It startled me so that I dropped the knife, hearing it hit the bone somewhere near my right foot. I dropped down to my knees and started a frantic blind search with my hands, desperately searching for the only weapon I had. The sudden and sharp pain below my knee was barely noticeable in my panicked state. My hands, like two bloodhounds attached to my arms, quickly sniffed out the knife. I put my feet under me and leaned back against the dirt wall again, my eyes surveying the darkness for the faint glow of the creature's own. Found it. It went back to its feast of bones. The pain below my knee was now noticeable. It burned almost, and I could feel a slight throbbing. My left hand worked its way down my leg to the source of the pain. I felt a rip in my jeans just below the knee, and the slick wetness of my own blood. 2 of my fingertips found the wound, and I jerked at the sting. I covered my mouth with my other hand, holding in any sound that might try to force its way out. I slowly felt for the wound again. It didn't seem too bad, but it was bleeding. I knew I had experienced much worse injuries than that, just from riding my bike, but down here in the dark, it seemed like the worst wound of my life. Could the thing, the bone eater, smell the blood? What if? No, I forced the thought out of my head. I slowly pushed my way up to my feet again, using the wall as support. Another sharp pain shot through me as my knee straightened out. I waited for it to pass, and then slowly shifted my feet to my left leg to see if I could stand on it. It held. I was okay. Just a scratch, I told myself. I reached around my waist and guided the knife into the sheath with both hands. This time it slid right in without a fight. I shuffled my way through the darkness back to the root. When I had my hand wrapped around it, I looked up towards the opening I fell through. From my new position, it seemed that I was actually more directly beneath the opening than I had been. Maybe this was possible. Maybe this was really going to work. There was still no light coming from the opening in the broken floor above, just a slight difference in darkness, enough for me to know it was there. Had it remained cloudy all day? How much time had passed? Was it nighttime? No matter. All I could think about at this point was escaping, freeing myself from the darkened prison cell I had mistakenly fallen into. The sound of chewing stopped, and I heard the bones shifting beneath the creature as it moved, the sound of its steps breaking through the pile of bones as it moved farther away. I felt a bit of relief. I had no idea how large this cavern was. Maybe it was a cave or a tunnel that went on for miles. Maybe it went all the way to the interstate. I hoped the monster would leave somehow, go far away and leave me alone to climb to my freedom. But the thunderous steps came to a halt, farther away than they had ever been, but the creature was not gone. I strained to see the glow of its eyes, but it was too far, too deep into the abyss to see them. I tilted my head back, looking up at my destination, trying again to judge the distance. It seemed so high. I didn't know how far I would even be able to climb, but I had to try. I wiped my hands on the thighs of my jeans, and reaching up as high as I could, gripped the root with both hands. I planted my right foot against the dirt wall and twisted the sole of my shoe, trying to dig into the hard-packed soil the best I could. With tightly pursed lips and gritted teeth, I began to pull my way up. My hands, my arms, and both my legs began to burn as my muscles worked to pull me up the root. I could climb the rope in gym class, all the way to the top, but it was a struggle. I certainly wasn't as strong of a climber as Jerry Barnes. Jerry was a bully and the strongest kid in the school. He could climb the rope using nothing but his arms. He used to do it to show off. Jerry would have already been out of this hole. I hated Jerry. I heaved and pulled again, another 6 inches. My left foot slipped, kicking dirt down onto the bones below. A sharp pain reminded me of my open cut below my knee. I ignored it and kept climbing. I was afraid if I stopped, I wouldn't be able to start again, and that wasn't an option now. I slid my right hand up the root, planted my foot, and pulled again. I got a good grip with both hands and tilted my head back once again to check my progress. The opening was still far out of reach, but it was definitely closer and easier to see. I listened for movement from the creature, but all was still. I continued my climb. Hand over hand, pull, step, step, I worked my way upward through the darkness. Like when you dive down into the lake and swim to the surface, waiting for your head to finally bust through to the air above. The anticipation was building with each burning tug, with each planted foot, with each desperate reach upward. I was now close enough that I could tell that it must be nighttime. There was no light coming in through the hole. The only reason it seemed visible was because of the lighter color of the concrete compared to the darkness of the cavern. I was almost there. I was almost free. I slid my hand up the root to continue my climb, but something happened. It hit something and came to an abrupt stop. I tightened my grip and carefully reached up with my other hand to investigate. The root had gone back into the earth. I had found the point that it had broke free from the dirt wall as it twisted and turned down into the abyss. I had reached the end of my ascent. I looked over towards the opening, which was painfully close. I no longer had to tilt my head so much as I had to turn it to see the opening in the broken floor. I secured my grip and reached out with my left hand. The muscles in my shoulder and arm stretched as I tried to reach the hole. Just out of reach, maybe no more than a foot or so past my outreached fingertips. My body was tired from the climb. I had to do something while I still had the energy. I thought to myself, what would Jerry Barnes do? I pictured Jerry climbing the rope in gym class, showing off. I saw him ringing the bell at the top and looking down at me with that stupid grin on his face. That was all the motivation I needed. I was going to jump for it. I took one last look back down into the void I had ascended from. How far down was the pile of bones? I wasn't sure at this point and no longer cared. All I cared about was the jump. I focused my attention on the opening. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was doable. I repositioned my hands on the root and bent my knees. The wound below my knee gave me a painful reminder it was still there. I angled my body best I could to launch myself towards the hole. I was focused. I was ready. Suddenly, as if it knew what I was planning, the creature let out a roar, vibrating my entire body, filling the entire cavern with the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. I almost lost my grip, but somehow managed not to let go. I could hear the monster scattering bones with each step as it made its way towards me. It was now or never. I took a deep breath and with a hard push, launched myself into the air. Once my hand let go of the root and my feet were no longer pressing against the earthen wall, everything seemed to go into slow motion. I could see the opening as I flew towards it. I could hear the sounds of the angry creature as it tore through the darkness and bones, realizing that it was about to lose me. I reached out my hands and made contact with the splintered edge of the broken floor. My body swung with momentum, and my fingers clamped down onto the wooden plank. But they did not hold. Despite all my might and willpower and desperate wanting, I could not manifest it into reality. I felt my fingertips slide off the edge of the wood, scraping and clawing at the splintered edge to no avail, and then the feeling of nothing as the darkness embraced me once again as I fell into the abyss, back into the bones. I hit the bones with a thud and a crash as they splashed up all around my body. The fall had knocked the wind out of me and almost knocked me out. My mind was filled with fog as I realized what had just happened. I could hear muffled sound, like when you're underwater and you hear people talking above the surface. But it wasn't voices I was hearing. As the fog started to clear, my hearing started to come back to normal, and what I heard made my entire body go numb. The creature. From just a few feet away, I could hear it popping bones beneath its weight as it drew closer. I could hear its deep, wheezing breath, but then I realized it was much more than that. Not only could I hear its breathing, I could feel it on my skin. Flat on my back, I laid motionless, my eyes adjusting to the darkness after the fall. I could now see the opening directly above me. But hope of escape was gone. The monster was so close to me now, I could feel the heat from its body. Any moment now it would grab me, and I'd hear the sounds of my own bones popping and cracking, and the disgusting slurping sounds it would make while it made me its latest meal. This was a fear that was like no other, an unnatural fear, a feeling of terror you were never meant to have, and it had fully embraced me. As I laid there, unable to move, riddled with paralyzing fear and emotions, the opening above me began to close. At first it was confusing, but I soon realized that it wasn't actually closing. Whatever light was trickling in from the hole was now being blocked entirely. I found myself looking at a familiar sight. Those two golf ball-sized glowing orbs I had watched for so long before. The creature was leaned over me now, staring down at me with those emotionless eyes. I thought to myself that the end was here, as I stared up into the creature's eyes, watching them get bigger and bigger as it got closer and closer. Those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. A feeling as though I was sinking into the bones came over me, and the eyes started to disappear into a dark fog as my lips went numb and my thoughts escaped me. The fear was too much for me. The entire situation was more than I could mentally withstand, and my body and mind shut down. The last thing I remember before falling into unconsciousness were those eyes staring down at me from just inches away, and in the darkness, a face started to appear around them. The face of a beast I had never seen before and have never seen since. But perhaps it was just a young man's imagination, my own conscious mind crossing over into the realm of nightmares. I'm afraid this is where the story takes a turn. Obviously, I lived to tell about it, so I must have escaped somehow, and I did. I surely did. But I have spent my entire life trying to understand how I did. What I just told you is the last memory I have of being down in that horrible pit of bones, with that terrible creature leaning over me, face to face, before losing consciousness. I'm not sure how much time passed. From within the dark recesses of my own mind, I started making my way back towards the light, back to the world of the awake. It was like coming out of a deep sleep. I awoke to a sound, a familiar sound. At first I was afraid it was the creature, but as the sound became clearer, I realized it wasn't the monster at all. It was the sound that had drawn me to this place to begin with, the barking of squirrels. I laid there for a moment, trapped in my own confusion, before slowly opening my eyes. The daylight was blinding after my time spent in total darkness. It was like opening your eyes after a deep sleep and staring directly into a flashlight. I squinted my eyes as my hand swam around me with the realization that I was no longer on a pile of bones, but on grass, soft grass and solid ground. I was outside. I sat up quickly with a moment of dizziness and looked around through squinted eyes. I was in the woods again, free from the hole, free from the reach of the creature. But how? I looked around, and there beside me was my knife, my canteen, and my rifle. Even my burlap sack with my grandma's dinner roll and the red handkerchief. I didn't understand. I still don't know how I came to be back on the surface. Who or what had carried me there? How did they get me out of the hole? Even more, where was I? I know, it doesn't make any sense. It never has, and I don't understand it to this day. But then, the young man that I was, I didn't care. I was relieved to be there. I was relieved to be alive. I burst out in tears, heavy, thick tears like giant raindrops poured down my cheeks. I couldn't help it. I slowly stood up and gathered my things. I wiped the tears from my eyes and, still sobbing, looked around, trying to find my bearings. I picked a direction and took off walking as fast as I could go. I wanted to run, but I was still a bit woozy, and I wasn't sure if I was even going in the right direction. I was hoping I'd run into the shoreline of the lake and be able to follow it back to the John boat. I'm not sure how long I walked. It could have been an hour. It could have been 3 hours. The entire time I wrestled with my own thoughts, trying to prevent the creature from creeping its way back into my head. Every time I let my guard down, I'd see those glowing eyes in my head, and there would be a sinking feeling in my stomach. I pulled out my grandma's roll and crammed the whole thing in my mouth before washing it down with the last bit of sweet tea from the canteen. It was completely warm and stale, and it was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted in my life. I was screwing the lid back on the canteen when I heard it. I stopped dead in my tracks and held my breath. There it was again, just faintly on the wind. The sound of my grandpa's voice yelling my name. I took my rifle off my shoulder and fired 3 shots into the air. That was what Grandpa told me to do if we ever got lost while out hunting together. I waited and listened. 3 shots replied in the distance. I took off running towards them as fast as my legs would carry me. The sound of his voice got louder and closer, and I ran faster and faster with each yell. I cried out, "Grandpa, Grandpa, I'm here!" Before long, I could see his bright red ball cap in the distance through the trees. I dropped my rifle on the ground and fell into him, wrapping my arms tightly around him, almost knocking him to the ground. Tears started flying from my eyes, soaking his flannel shirt. He pulled me back by my shoulders and asked if I was all right. I just nodded yes and watched the old man start to cry. The only time in my life I ever saw him cry, and the tears were for me. He picked up my rifle and wrapped his arms around me and guided me back to the little inlet where the John boat was. I climbed in his old aluminum fishing boat as he tied a length of rope to tow the John boat back across the lake. I never told my grandparents or anyone what actually happened. I told everyone I had gotten turned around and lost. They didn't press the issue too hard. I don't know if they believed it or were just relieved that I was home, safe. By the time it was all said and done, I had been gone for a full day. It was late morning the next day when Grandpa found me. Like I said, I never had any recollection of how I got out of the hole or who moved me to where I woke up at. I never went back to look for the building or to see if the creature was still there. That's my story. I wouldn't blame anyone for not believing it. Sometimes I don't believe it myself. Was I a young man with a vision, or am I an old man with a dream? I'm not really sure anymore, and over the years I tried to forget it ever happened. But then I look down and see the scar below my knee, and I see the bone eater staring down at me with those dull, glowing eyes.